You're watching Debrief. I'm Narit Ben, and these days all eyes are on the U.S., where policy rhetoric, really the entire landscape, is in question and constantly shifting. But while focus is there, major changes are continuing right here in the Middle East, and they're all changes that the White House will need to face. A big part of that is Iran. This week in Tel Aviv, a conference got underway to break down exactly that. Before we get into it with our guests, a quick look at why this all matters. Iran's really big footprint across the Middle East. Syria is on top of the list. Iran is a major ally of the Assad regime and supporting its fight with money, intel, and security advisors, and its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces on the ground. Part of that support also happens just next door in Lebanon. There, Iran is the primary financer of the Shiite militia Hezbollah that's also fighting for Assad in Syria. Then there's Iraq. In the fight against IS, Iran is backing Shiite forces. Recent estimates put their number of fighters there up to 100,000. In Yemen's conflict, it's really a proxy war between Iran and its regional arch-rival, Saudi Arabia. There, Tehran is backing Houthi rebels against a Saudi and US-backed president. And finally, one more place its footprint is deep in Gaza, where Iran funds Hamas, part of what it calls a principled policy of supporting the fight against Israel. Joining me here in the studio is Professor Uzi Rabi, who took part in that conference. He's also director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and our senior Middle East correspondent, Mohammed Al-Qasim. Thanks both very much for being here. Uzi, I want to start with you and this conference. Iran has been painted as a major threat, certainly in Israel for a very long time, also from the United States. What is changing now that sort of prompted this conference?
Well, I think that the big change is that Iran is capitalizing on the crash of the Arab world. And as we said in the beginning, actually, Iran has installed itself in all these failed states all over the region. And basically what they are aiming at is compiling a territorial corridor from the head of the Persian Gulf to the eastern flank of the Mediterranean. This is something that Iran is doing cunningly, in a very sophisticated way. And when everybody is intensely focusing on ISIS, Iran is capitalizing on that and creating kind of a Middle East where Iran has become, I would dare say, sort of a regional superpower.
On that note, let's bring Iranian journalist Camila Entikhabi-Fard into the conversation, joining us from New York. Camila, great to see you.
Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about Iran under the new Trump administration. You probably just heard what Professor Uzi Rabi had to say. Is Iran changing its strategy now?
Thanks for hosting me. Changing the strategy depends on what's going on in international scene for Iran. Since the revolution, they mainly pursued one policy, and that to export the revolution and the Shiism around the region. But as the professor pointed in the studio, now the time has been a little bit changed for them. And in order to can keep their influences and also their impact in the region, I assume they are stepping back and they were showing more kind of competence with the other countries, perhaps with Saudi Arabia, in order to keep Iran nuclear deal alive. The changes in Washington, D.C. has been threatening Iran nuclear deal. They are aware. Last week, IMF, the International Monetary Fund chief, Ms. Lagarde, clearly said there is a clause about Iran nuclear deal, and so much has been changed in a good way in Iran as an investors, as the inflation, and if this deal has been jeopardized, that would be a big disaster for Iran. So Iranians understand the consequences and the importance of keeping the deal alive, and in my opinion, they want to reduce the tension in the region rather than to still pursue that kind of combating attitude.
Camila, stay with us. Mohammed, one thing that does seem certain is that the Iran-Assad-Russia axis is getting stronger in this changing Middle East.
Well, at least it's the Iran-Assad axis is still strong. The Iran-Russia axis, it depends on the situation in Syria. Russia is very threatened and worried about the presence and influence of Iran in Syria. This is a marriage of convenience between Russia and Iran. But Iran is very much involved and entrenched in the Syrian conflict, and they are going to go all the way with President Bashar al-Assad in the 6-year civil war in Syria. This is one way of Iran to grow and expand its regional influence. I agree with the professor here, and I would dare to even expand and say that they are already a regional power. And this is why we've seen a shift even among the Arab countries, mainly the Arab Sunni countries led by Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, that see Iran is the major threat to them. It's the major issue for the Arab countries now. It's not the Palestinian issue anymore. It's not the Islamic State. Iran is number one, then terrorism is number two, and probably the Palestinian issue comes in third.
So let's bring one more piece of this puzzle into the conversation. Turkey was also a big element described in this. It features in the Syrian situation. Let's look at a little bit what was said just this week about that, because Iran is a major ally of the Assad regime, and it and Turkey have been on opposite sides of that war. But this week, a change in tone from Iranian President Rouhani. He said resolving their political differences can lead to regional stability. But Iran's Syrian allies differ pretty strongly. In the ongoing talks on the Syrian war in Geneva, the head of Syria's government delegation took a harder line on Turkey. He said this.
So from the beginning, we considered the Turkish military incursion into our country as a military aggression. So even before the Turkish forces entered our territory, we were referring to the Turkish terrorism which comes from within Turkish territory. So we reserve our right to use all means available, according to international law, in order to repel Turkish forces from our territory and liberate the territory that they occupy.
A changing rivalry, a changing relationship between Iran and Turkey, why is that so important now?
Well, I think that Iran and Turkey are aiming at the same spot, becoming kind of a hegemon in the region. So basically, there is a natural rivalry here. There are some actually tactics here and there, and they could cooperate actually when it comes to an ad hoc situation. But basically, if you look at what Iran is doing in Iraq, it would do actually to cut off or to minimize, I would say, Turkish stronghold. If the Turks hold, for example, kind of a prominence position in Erbil, the Iranians have Sulaymaniyah. If the Turks actually are trying to capitalize on the elimination of ISIS in Mosul, Iran is there with its Shia militias. So let me give you kind of a bottom line. The problem is going to start the day after the elimination of ISIS in Mosul, because there we're going to see not actually everybody versus ISIS, but we're going to see the Turkish-Kurdish rift and mainly actually the Iranians with all others.
We're going to zoom in much closer at what's happening in Iraq and Iran's role in that. But first, Camelia, just briefly, if you're to give us a bottom line on Iran in a changing Middle East with a changing Washington in the background, is a harder line on the way?
I'm not thinking the same way as Professor described the situation between Iran, Turkey, and Syria. I just came back from Geneva talks. I was in Geneva for the Syria talks. And I'm not seeing not Iran, not Turkey at the bottom line can keep their influences and the spot they have in Syria, even if the peace has been granted between. Why? Simply because Syria is an Arab nation, and Arab nationality usually stands further than any other interest the country may have. A great example is Iraq and Lebanon. Iran so much spends of money and the troops and the logistics support in post-Saddam Hussein time, but as we were seeing today, Iraqis are not welcoming Iranians. And in Lebanon too, the president has been elected, but he preferred to go to Saudi Arabia first rather than visiting Iran. In Syria too.
Camille, unfortunately, we have to pause right there. Thank you very much for now. Professor Uzi Rabi, Mohammed Al-Qasim, stay with us. We're going to continue this conversation after the break and zoom in on another key place you've already heard mentioned here, Iran and the U.S. with their hand in Iraq, what they're doing there now, and what the long-term goals really are. Back here on Debrief, continuing the conversation, zooming in on Iran and the changing Middle East. Shifts that the changing American administration will have to reckon with at one point or another. And one key part of that is Iraq. There, around 100,000 Iranian-backed fighters are stationed. And just in 13 days since a U.S.-backed offensive on western Mosul began, over 28,000 people have been forced out of their homes. Over 176,000 displaced in just a 4-month fight for that city.
The situation is tragic. We were trapped. We were more like prisoners. We are from Wadi al-Hajar, and from there we were displaced to Tal al-Ruman, where we stayed for 2 days until we had the opportunity to flee to al-Maman district under the cover of the army's fire. And thanks to God, we made it.
Journalist Fazil Harami is joining us from Erbil, Iraq. Fazil, great to have you as always. We see those images, we hear some of those statements coming out from the tens of thousands of people who are fleeing Mosul. Where are they going?
Well, there is a camp in south of Mosul in Hammam al-Alil. Around 4,000 people. You can accommodate up to 4,000 people. So people are basically coming out. They just want to flee the violence and the fighting. And it doesn't matter where they go when you talk to them. They just want to be away from the fighting and from the hunger that is like prevalent in western Mosul because it's been under siege for the last 4 months. So people are just flying into camps.
4 months into that fight, how would you describe the status of the U.S.-backed Iraqi forces that are leading that fight?
Well, the Iraqis have, as you know, they've taken East Mosul in late January, and they've started the offensive to take western Mosul about 2 weeks ago. They've taken several neighborhoods. They've taken the airport. The fighting is intense, but their progress is steady. And you have the Hashd, or the Popular Mobilization Unit in west of Mosul, northwest. They're also coming in towards Mosul. So they're basically moving in slowly but steadily. But ISIS is fighting really hard.
How are Iraqi forces there looking at the transition in the United States, with undoubtedly a lot of questions over where really the U.S. is taking this fight?
Well, to be honest with the security forces, they're concerned about western Mosul. Initially, when the ban came out that Iraq and other countries, 6 other countries were banned, there was some discussion. But right now, the commanders that you speak to, the soldiers that you speak to, what they focus on is to get rid of ISIS in western Mosul. And they appreciate the efforts of the American-led coalition, and also the efforts that generally the Western advisors are making on the ground and very close to the front line in assisting the Iraqi security forces.
Fazil Harami in Erbil, Iraq. Thanks very much for weighing into the conversation today. I want to bring back into the studio Professor Uzi Rabi, Director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and our senior Middle East correspondent, Mohammed El-Qasim. So we're continuing the conversation, namely about a changing Middle East and Iran's role in it. Mohammed, when we're looking at around 100,000 Iran-backed Shiite fighters in Iraq, let's start with their immediate goals. What are they doing there right now?
Well, before I answer this one, let me just take you 13 years before, when the biggest winner of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, it was Iran. It toppled Saddam Hussein, who for a long time was the preventative, so to speak, force, not allowing the Islamic State revolution to be exported from Iran into the Arab world. Now,
and history always comes back to haunt everybody here.
Exactly. And now we see the expansion and the great influence of Iran inside Iraq. 100,000, those are active force in Iraq. In many cases, they're much better equipped and they're very well trained. In some cases, better than the Iraqi army itself, which only has a couple of good units that are well trained, but the rest of it is just undertrained units. And that's why in any fight that the Iraqi army took in Iraq, it was because of the Shiite militias trained and backed by the Iranians that supported the Iraqi army. And this is why, and this is how influential Iran has become. Qasem Soleimani sometimes would be on the ground monitoring and actually running the battlefield. We've seen it in Fallujah and elsewhere in Iraq.
A sign of how important that fight is to them. So Uzi, let's be real for a moment. As much as we'd all like to believe that Iran is just there out of the goodness of their own hearts to rescue Iraq and fight off IS, it's always about interests, long-term goals. What is Iran looking to do in the long term in Iraq?
Well, first of all, I fully agree with what Mohammed said about how precious Iraq is in the terms of Iranian foreign policy. First of all, we have to bear this in mind. Iraq is a cornerstone in the Iranian Middle Eastern foreign policy for religious regions, political regions, economic regions, military regions, etc. Now, just to be brief and sharp on that, what Iran have in mind is, first of all, not to see the Americans once again back there. In any case, the Americans are not actually in kind of a position to reshape Iraq. Okay, that is one thing. The other thing, which is very, very cynical and sophisticated, very vicious for Iraqis, is to keep Iran integrated but very weak. And this goes back to what Muhammad said here. What the Iranians have in Iraq is a huge power, soft penetration of economic posture, and especially al-Hashd al-Sha'bi or Shiite militias, which are going actually to act on or under the auspices of Iran in Iraq, weakening Abadi, the prime minister, and the same thing you're going to see actually nearby Mosul, in Sulaymaniyah. Again, Nurit, we should not forget that. This is part and parcel of a territorial corridor being stretched from the head of the Persian Gulf to the eastern flank of the Mediterranean.
So, Uzi, I want to ask you real quick if we're to look at another part of this story, which is the new White House, the Trump administration, whose policies are very much up in the air. What do you think, knowing all of that about what's happening now in the Middle East, about how Iran is sort of spreading its wings all over the place?
I think that this is a right to the point question, because this is what I am concerned about. I don't see any power in the region that could cope with Iran after having mentioned what I mentioned. And unfortunately, I doubt whether the Trump administration is going actually to come up with interventionist policy. So I think that we are going to have a different Middle East where Iran cunningly managed to capitalize on the breakup of states, and it becomes kind of a threat to Sunni states, to Israel. They could collaborate, of course, but they could not actually cope with this threat, because we have to remember, Russia is here, and even if there are some differences between Russia and Iran, still, Russia is kind of a power that backs up Iran, and this is something that Iran takes into consideration.
Mohammed, let's wrap with some of your thoughts on where the Middle East is going, some bottom lines on that.
Well, I think for the time being, Iran was successful in filling the vacuum that was created post the Arab Spring, but also starting in 2003 with the collapse of the Ba'athist government in Baghdad, in Iraq, with the fall of Saddam Hussein. It's in a very strong position. It's able to destabilize the region, making itself a very formidable power and a regional power in the region, and that's why we're seeing other Arab countries and even Israel seeing it as the main threat, but this makes it even difficult to threaten Iran. Iran is very much in a very strong position, and it's very difficult to attack it militarily. It's going to have to be a diplomatic way.
A very important conversation about a very changing region while everybody's focused on the White House. Professor Uzi Rabi, Mohammed Al-Qasim, thanks very much for taking part in the conversation.